Hey, what's up guys, it's Texumer talking to you here, and today I want to talk about the MacBook Pro lineup. And yes, I want to compare the M1 Max, M1 Pro MacBook Pros to the M1 MacBook Pro. And if you are an entry-level consumer, which computer should you buy? Should you settle for the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch and get the touch bar, keyboard and all display, or pay a little bit extra, go for the $2,000 base model M1 Pro MacBook Pro, or even spend the extra money to get the full fat version of the M1 Pro, or even the 16-inch big size M1 Max. So in this video I will take a look at the full lineup and tell you which one is best for you. Of course, I will tell you between very different price categories, like for example the base models, which would be around $1,300 to $2,000, which will cover the M1 Pro base line and the M1 MacBook Pro's 13-inch. Of course, then we have the M1 Pro and M1 Max, but those are not as important because I want to focus more on these two computers, the two base models, the $1,300 M1 Pro MacBook Pro or the $2,000 M1 Pro MacBook Pro 14-inch. So these two are very interesting to look at because they sit in very specific zones of the market. One competes with the M1 MacBook Air and the other one competes with the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch. And of course, it's $400 cheaper than the full-fat M1, but it's around $500 to $400 more expensive than the equivalent M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch. So before we take a look at this new and improved MacBook Pro lineup, roll the intro. Let's first start with the base models. The base M1 Pro MacBook Pro starts at $1,999, which comes with a binned M1 Pro chip. This chip only comes with 8 cores, the same as the M1, but it features 6 high-performance cores and 2 high-efficiency cores, while the M1 features 4 high-performance cores and 4 high-efficiency cores. So the M1 Pro binned is more focused on performance, and you can see by results. The M1 Pro is around 27% faster in multi-core performance, and it has the same single-core performance because it has the same cores. So I think that you can see by this jump in performance, the M1 Pro is more geared to the people that want all of the performance and can sacrifice a little bit of the efficiency. But of course the efficiency is not that bad. It comes around with a 16-hour battery life, 18-hour battery life, while the M1 MacBook Pro comes with a 20-hour battery life. Better, but not that much better. And I think that with everything that you get on the base model 14-inch, it's worth it to pay the extra $400 because you get more RAM, which is 16 gigabytes of RAM, while the M1 MacBook Pro starts only at 8 gigabytes. You get 512, while the M1 MacBook Pro starts at 256. And if you start adding up all these things on top of the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch, you will get around $1,600 to $700. You will get around to $1,700, which is way more expensive than the base model, and it's close to the $2,000 starting price of the M1 Pro MacBook Pro. So, in my opinion, if you are looking at these two computers trying to decide which one should you go for, surely based on hardware, then go for the M1 Pro, because although it's $300 more expensive to the equivalent M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch, it's better in every single way. It has a mini LED display, which is ProMotion, the same as the more expensive models. It has the new improved design, has more ports, has more battery, not more battery, but it has a more bigger battery capacity. It has better thermal design, better performance, more RAM, and more storage in terms of speeds. Also, the cameras from the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch to the M1 Pro bin version 14-inch are quite a difference, because the new M1 Pro 14-inch has a new camera array, which is a 1080p camera. But you might be thinking 720 to 1080p, it's not that much and it doesn't make a lot of difference. Well, you're wrong, because the M1 Pro features the new ISP and improves the image so much that the differences in quality between the 720p camera on the old MacBook Pros to the new 1080p camera is just insane. Take a look at this test that I did on my M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro with its camera, and you will notice the differences between the 1080p. Of course, I have a 720p camera, also my 13-inch MacBook Pro from 2016, and you can see that the differences are just ridiculous. So take a look at these tests and you will realize how different they are and how good Apple has made the new 1080p webcams that the new MacBook Pros have, and those are only available on the $2,000 upwards MacBook Pros, which have the M1 Pro bin version, full fat version, and the M1 Max. This is the camera and microphone from the M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro in good lighting. Then, of course, we have charging speeds. Those are different too. If you go for the full fat M1 Pro and full fat M1 Max, you will get the incredible fast charging on the new MacBook Pros, which will charge in 30 minutes 50% of your battery. But if you owned the normal version of the M1 Pro, the bin version, which is the most cheap version of the MacBook Pro lineup in terms of the new MacBook Pros, then you will only receive a 76 watt brick. So that's not available to fast charge, but that only costs $30 more to upgrade for the faster charging speed. So for only $30 more, for $2,030, you can get a fast charging enabled MacBook Pro, while the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch doesn't have that option. So again, if you really like and want fast charging, your only options, I believe, are from the $2,000 bin version 14-inch MacBook Pro upwards. So I think that when looking at these two computers, the M1 Pro bin version at $2,000 seems a way better deal than the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch. But there's a place for this computer on the market, and that's the Touch Bar, because the Touch Bar is not available on any new MacBook Pro. It's only available on the 13-inch MacBook Pro, the last computer to get it. And I believe that Apple will completely kill this computer by, I don't know, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 months when they release the M2. And by killing it, they will completely get rid of it. Apple will probably release a new M2 MacBook Air, and by doing this, they will completely get rid of the Touch Bar of their lineup. It's quite sad, I know, but I don't use it, I never used it, and I don't miss it on my computer. I like my function key row, but there's a lot of people that like the Touch Bar, but there's a lot more that don't. That's why Apple killed it. So if you love the Touch Bar, if you don't like the ports like Nick and Sweeney from the Taylors of Tech podcast, then you are the right person for the 13-inch MacBook Pro. But if you are any other person, like a normal person, go for the M1 Pro bin version. It's the best version of you. It has a better mini LED display with ProMotion. It has more RAM, more storage, and if you try to match those up on the other computer, you end up almost spending the same money as the M1 Pro while losing some of performance, some GPU power, and losing the display, which is just amazing, and of course the ports. So on the base model fight and on the lower price tags, you should go for the more expensive model, which is the M1 Pro, MacBook Pro 14-inch. But it's a very different story when you start climbing up those ladders, because it gets way expensive when you try to go for the M1 Max chip. So before we jump into this M1 Pro versus M1 Max discussion, you have to go and analyze the view. Do you want a 14-inch size or do you want a 16-inch size? Because there are some differences that are very, very important, and they were discovered by Max Tech. Because if you go for 14-inch size, then you should probably go for the M1 Max with the 24 core. That's the better deal for you. You spend the extra $200 to go to the M1 Max, but you don't upgrade to another $200 for the go to the 32 core GPU, because the 14-inch throttles when using the M1 Max. So if you do want an M1 Max chip and you want to go for the 14-inch, do not buy the 32 core GPU. You will sacrifice on battery life and you won't gain like more than 2% of performance, so it's not worth it. But if you want an M1 Pro, then the discussion is quite different, because you have to choose between the 14-inch size and the 16-inch size. Well, those two have almost the same performances when using the M1 Pro, and of course the GPU and CPU power on the M1 Pro 16-inch will be a tiny bit better because of course thermal design, but the M1 14-inch and the M1 Pro 14-inch, it has been designed in a way that the differences in performance are so negligible that you won't notice any differences, and if you want the smaller size, you should go for the smaller size, but only if you don't want the most amount of performance from your computer and battery life, because the best battery life on all of these MacBook Pros is the 16-inch M1 Pro, because the 16-inch is just incredible, it has a huge battery, and the M1 Pro is more efficient than the M1 Max. So if you are looking for the best battery life and the best bang for your buck in terms of battery life, then the 16-inch M1 Pro option is the option for you. It's a little bit more expensive, it starts at $2,400, but it's a great option. It's more cheap than the M1 Max computer. It has way better battery life and it's almost as powerful in terms of CPU and GPU power. Of course, you can upgrade that RAM too to 32 gigabytes and you have a huge computer, an amazing computer. If you only need a CPU powered computer, don't need a GPU, then go for the M1 Pro. If you don't edit videos because the M1 Max has 2 more encoders than the M1 Pro, then you should go for the M1 Max. If you edit videos, the M1 Max is the best option for you. It's way faster, it shaves off a lot of power, and between those two, if you really care about GPU, you only have one option, which is the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the 32 GPU core, because that computer does thermally throttle like the 14-inch. It's not hard capped by Apple, and so you can take the most amount of performance from the M1 Max. And then you have the high power mode, which makes your computer even more powerful, and I believe that those two differences makes it worth it to go for the 16-inch if you really care about GPU. But if you don't, then, and if you want a 14-inch computer, you should go for the 24-core, save the extra $200 and get the 24-core GPU option for the M1 Max. If you want the M1 Pro, then it's only a difference in matter of size or battery life. If you prefer more battery life and bigger size display, you should go for the 16-inch. If you want to spend less money and have a better computer, because you can save on $200, you can add up on the 14-inch, go for the 14-inch. By the 14-inch, you have a smaller package with the same amount of performance, and you can put those $200 to, I don't know, RAM or maybe more cores on your CPU, but you should probably put it on RAM. And again, this is a great deal. You can buy even more storage with those $200. So this lineup is very well built. I believe that it makes a lot of choices for the right people, and I believe that if you make the right choices, you can get the best computer for you and the best bang for your buck, because I believe these MacBook Pros are not overpriced. They right now one of the best, not the best performing computers on the market, and in terms of prices, when you start comparing to the laptops, Windows laptops, you realize that they are not more expensive and they have way better battery life, way better display, they have way better builds because it's way more premium. They have aluminium, they have glass, while the other computers are almost all plastic. So between all these computers, the M1s and M1 Pros and M1 Max computers are the best bang for your buck right now. If you don't want that, well, it's an ARM computer. Well, you won't have any like support for x86 native, but you will be able to do a lot of things. But if you are a gamer, these computers might not be for you, although the M1 Max computer, it's incredibly powerful and it can game very well too, but the support for macOS is kind of crap, so I don't advise you buying these computers to game. But again, all of these computers have a same amazing design. The M1 Pro MacBook Pro and the M1 Max MacBook Pros have the new squared off design with more ports, the new mini LED display, which is incredible. They have the best keyboard ever, which is the Magic Keyboard, have the best trackpad ever, which is the haptic touch trackpad, which has that thing of it doesn't click like the iPhone 8 and iPhone 7 home button. But the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch also has that. It has the old design, it has less ports. It has the good keyboard, the same Magic Keyboard that the other two have. It has a smaller LCD display, which is not mini LED, but it's quite good still. It's not 120 Hz though. And it has a touch bar, which might be a deal breaker for you if you like it or if you hate it. Because if you hate it, you won't buy this computer, even if you prefer it. And if you like it a lot, then it's a deal breaker because you won't be able to buy any other MacBook on the lineup. So if you really want the M1 MacBook Pro because you don't have the money for the M1 Pro MacBook Pro, then I advise you going and saving a little bit more, few $100s, and going for the M1 MacBook Air. The performance differences are negligible, the battery differences are also negligible, and the M1 MacBook Air is an amazing computer. Although, if you really want a very small, very powerful, and very thin computer, wait until March timeline. Try to not buy nothing right now, and go for the M2 MacBook Air, because I have a video on my channel about that. And I think the M2 MacBook Air will sell like hotcakes. It's a really incredible computer. The leakers are telling us that this computer will have an amazing performance, and I'm very excited to know more about this computer in the future, but it hasn't been released yet, so you only have options that are released. And of course, the M1 MacBook Air is the best choice for you if you want to save the most amount of money and you want a laptop. If you are a student, also, that's a great option for you. But if you really want a little bit more performance, then ignore the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch and jump right onto the 14-inch binned version of the M1 Pro MacBook Pro. Again, the M1 Max and the full-fat M1 Pro are more for the pros because those start to go around for $2,400 and have way more storage and RAM options, which tend to be very expensive. You can spend almost to $6,000 on these computers, which is quite a lot. And if you are not a pro, a very prosumer, then you shouldn't even spend and consider spending that much computer money on it, because in the end of the day, it's not worth it. In about 6, 7, 8 years, you will trade your computer and you won't use any of those performances because you only do documents and stuff. So that's all I had to say about this lineup. The new MacBook Pro lineup is incredible. I couldn't be more happy with my computer. I have a review about 1 month later of my MacBook Pro and I only have good things to tell about it. Of course, the M1 Max MacBook Pro is not for everyone, like I told you in that video. It's very expensive. Even if you go for the 14-inch size, it's very expensive. The differences between the 14-inch and the 16-inch size is always $200. Remind of that. So if you want to spend a lot of money, then I'm steering you over to the 16-inch MacBook Pro. But if you want to save on money, then you should go for the M1 MacBook Air or even go for the M1 Pro bin version, which I believe right now is the best option for most amount of people on the new MacBook Pro lineup. Ignore the M1 MacBook Pro, please. It's not a good computer right now. Although it has the M1 chip, which is very powerful, it will be discontinued. It has old hardware and it's not that great in 2021, or at least at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. But what are your thoughts on the new MacBook Pro lineup? Which computer should you get? Which computer are you getting on this Christmas? Do you have one already? And of course, Apple is now delivering the new MacBook Pros and are starting to get over the deliveries. So if you are getting one soon, don't forget to leave a like down below and tell me and show me your support, or even tell me what's about your experience of those computers on the comments down below. Also, don't forget to share with your friends. Tell more people about my channel. I want to grow. Thank you for watching my videos. And of course, this was Tex Talking to you here. Bye.